Hello and welcome back to Firebase Semi-live. So as you recall in our last episode, we have basically implemented our favorites button, right? Like we click on that, it goes out, calls the Cloud function, gets some data back about our favorite restaurants, and then within our browser now we've actually done the work to go ahead and render those favorite restaurants, which is great. And so basically we did this by creating two completely separate functions. We have a viewFavorites function, as well as our viewList function used for sort of viewing most of our restaurants. And we started a little work of sort of refactoring this by extracting the render restaurant card into a separate function. And then I said, you know what, probably the right thing to do here at this point is like, let's just sort of combine these two functions back into one. I'm going to add a favorites argument to our view list. And if that is equal to true, I think what we'll do is then we'll show our favorites. And then probably we won't need this viewFavorites function as like a completely separate thing. Let's do that. Let's do a little combining of our functions here. So let's see. I think the first thing we can do is, all right, so let's get our filter description working. Here, you know what? If favorites, then we can say filter description equals your favorite restaurants. And then this will still stay true if favorites is false and filter description is null. And then let's see. At some point, we're going to need to change the behavior of this, right? Like change this behavior if favorites is true. But let's look at sort of viewing the rest of this. So here's our render results. And we have this function, and I actually don't like this argument called doc because we might not necessarily be passing in a doc. It might actually be a document, or it might be some JSON data. So let's call this restaurant. And for starters, I'll go ahead and sort of replace that here, 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 and here. And then let's see here. Let's go ahead and make sure that we actually get the right data at the right place. So here, let's create our restaurant data function and our rest ID, variable. And here's what we're going to do here. And again, like if you're cringing at this because we're sort of assuming different things about this restaurant variable, depending on if favorites is true or not, I totally get that. There's definitely cleaner ways of doing this. This is going to work for now, so I'm going to do it. So if favorites is true, it means we're looking at a favorites list. It means the restaurant here is a JSON-y object. So we're going to say our restaurant data equals restaurant. And we can say that rest ID equals restaurant. And we're going to look at the contents of this ID field. Otherwise, rest data equals restaurant data, and our rest ID equals restaurant dot.id. Because here, restaurant is a document. And then basically we can go ahead and render a restaurant card using these two variables, rest data and rest ID. And that should actually do it to show the proper restaurant card depending on what we're getting back from our function. And so then let's see here. This should be pretty easy. We could say here, if favorites, this dot get favorites, and we'll pass in our render results. And then this all can be, else if we're doing any filtered restaurant or any filters applied, then go ahead and show some filter results. Otherwise, get all restaurants. That's looking pretty good. I think this should work. And then that means way up here, this whole giant viewFavorites function always makes me feel good when I can do this, select a whole bunch of code and delete it. By the way, you should probably actually, do a little git commit or something before you go ahead and delete code, just in case you need to roll back. But here we're going to just delete all that, and we're going to say viewList. And you know what? I actually don't care within viewList what our filters or our filter description are. I'm just going to pass in true so that we can view our favorites. Let's see here. I think it should probably work. Let's give it a try and see. What am I forgetting? I'm probably forgetting something, but let's reload and see. All right, so we got our list of all our restaurants. I should probably make sure that, like, all these filters and stuff still work. Do some actual. All right, that's cool. Let's, but the important thing, let's go ahead and view our favorites, and they're still there. All right, awesome. And oh, did you see up here? Now it's telling us that we're seeing our favorite restaurants. That's nice. Well, gosh, we basically have a function that works now. And if you're watching this video series for the purpose of like learning how to use Cloud Functions so you could, perform SQL-like joins on your NoSQL Cloud Firestore database, we're kind of at the end of that part of the lesson. But there's a bunch of cleanup work that we probably should be doing here. Like we probably should add the ability to add and remove favorites within our app so that we don't have to hard code it in to our code like this. And probably, make this favorites button change state so that like we can go from viewing our favorites to like not viewing our favorites. And, fix up our navigation. I noticed our navigation's a little broken. Like if I go into here and then close it, I'm now back at sort of the main screen instead of viewing my favorites again. And also, I'm not quite sure what's going to happen if we ask for favorites that doesn't exist. I think that's going to kind of bork things. If you want to sit around and watch me flail around with JavaScript a little more and maybe learn a little bit more of Cloud Firestore stuff along the way, go ahead and keep watching. But like I said, if you're watching this series for like, how do I, call functions in the cloud so I can do these SQL-like joins, that part of the lesson, hopefully you should kind of understand by now. But let's clean this up together. I think none of us like seeing our app the way it is right now in sort of this mostly working but also kind of broken state. So I'm going to tackle that last thing first. What happens if we ask for a favorite that doesn't exist? So let's go ahead and let's change. I'm going to add in a new favorite. Stick it in the middle here. Call it A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I'm pretty sure that is not an actual name of a restaurant. So what happens if I run this? All right. Well, it's funny. I have my data, and I still see those two restaurants. But you'll notice here, it's now telling me, you got no results. And I think basically the reason this is happening is if we were to go back to our viewList function, you'll notice all of this kind of like, hey, let's show the user that they have no data. It does this whenever you pass in a restaurant that is essentially null. It sort of assumes that you either get restaurants that are always going to be something or, a restaurant that's null. It didn't sort of think about this situation where you might pass in, or you might have one restaurant somewhere in the middle of your array that's going to be null. Admittedly, for the purpose of the sample app, that probably wouldn't happen. In this app, it could happen. Like, let's say I add a restaurant to my favorites and then, that restaurant closes and, we end up deleting that original document. We could end up in this state where suddenly it looks like we've broken our favorites list for everybody. So we are kind of making some dangerous assumptions here around our restaurants. And again, I'm going to fix this in a little bit of a hacky way, which is I'm just going to say, let's just at least strip out any nulls from our response array. So let's see. Going back into our Cloud function here, we have our snapshots and we're, creating our snapshot data and our snapshot ID. And I don't know if snapshots has, or if TypeScript has a flat map. Does it? No, I guess. Okay, no, it doesn't know what flat map is. In Swift, I believe there's this function called flat map. It works like map, except it automatically strips out nulls, if I remember right. But you know what? This we can fix with a filter. Actually, this is going to be the easiest filter in the world. As long as item is item, then I think it'll work. So basically, all we're doing here is we're saying, as long as you have an item that evaluates to something, then go ahead and keep it in the array, but filter out anything that's nil. I'm going to npm run build that. Go back in and reload. Let's look at our favorites. And there we go. Now we are back to just getting these two restaurants from our Cloud function. So we fixed that. Again, I think probably the right thing to do is actually not have this render function kind of not have this whole empty state screen fire if it gets any restaurant that happens to be null, but probably more look at sort of the overall results and see, if there's no data in there at all, then render this, otherwise sort of skip over things that are null. That's probably the right thing to do, but that would be a lot more work of sort of changing this sample app than we really want to do. Next, let's see. I would actually love it if we could get rid of this entire bit in general where we're hard coding in favorites. We should probably make it so our user can add and remove favorites. So let's do that. I think actually at this point we're pretty much done with our Cloud Function work. And because I would sort of like to have our data persist from sort of one session to the next, I'm going to go ahead and move our database and our functions off of our local emulator and actually kind of put it all into the cloud again. Let's see here. I'm going to do two things. Up here in friendly eats, well here, first let's kill our Control-C, our local emulator. Thanks for all your work. And then this part here, basically, I'm just going to comment out. So this was saying, hey, remember, if we're sort of serving off of localhost, then make sure that we use localhost for our Firestore location, and also tell our functions to go ahead and call localhost for any callable functions. I am going to still be serving our web pages locally, but I am not going to be running a local version of our functions or our database, so I'm just going to go ahead and comment this part out. And then I think we can just deploy it. Let's see. Firebase deploy only functions. We probably could also get rid of these other two sample functions if we wanted, but I like having them around. But actually, for a real app, make sure that your API surface that's exposed to the world is as small as possible, right? And that means functions like this, where anybody could call them and it's actually looking at your database. Like this is actually another sort of vector for someone to try and do something within your app that they shouldn't be doing. And so, as a general rule, if you have functions like this that really aren't being used, you're probably going to want to actually sort of remove them. All right, looks like that worked, which is sort of surprising because I've actually run into issues before where like this didn't work and it was like, hey, Cloud Firestore wasn't listed as a dependency. If that does happen, and some quick Googling has figured this out for me, you basically sort of want to go into your functions folder and call like npm install save exact. Google-cloud/Firestore. I believe this is, and I don't have this memorized. This was just sort of something that I've found through some various documentation of if you actually have a cloud function that needs to call Cloud Firestore for something, this is sort of the incantation that you would use to kind of make sure that like npm installs all the right dependencies. I must have done this earlier when I was testing this out, which is why I didn't run into this problem. But if you do, that's kind of the call you have to make. So just double check that in case you get some sort of weird dependency issue. But it looks like I got my functions up and running. I actually probably don't need to do Firebase deploy, only Firestore. Because remember, what this really does is it just sort of deploys our rules and our indexes up to Cloud Firestore. That thing has still been running in the cloud this whole time, so that this probably wasn't necessary. But I did it anyway. So I'm going to call Firebase serve, and that's just going to run sort of the local version of our, it actually is going to kind of run our local versions of our emulator or our functions, but I'm not going to care about that. What I really care about is sort of, again, just kind of running Cloud Firestore locally. Or sorry, running the web instance locally, but talking to Cloud Firestore in the cloud. And this sure looks like the version of my database that I had set up, way back at the beginning of the session before we started looking at sort of our emulated Cloud Firestore. But I bet you if I look at favorites, it's going to take a little bit for this to work because remember, this is sort of the first time we have deployed our functions to the cloud and we got that cold hard start time and ended up with an empty array, which is correct because, our code is essentially still hard coding our favorites array and we don't even want that. Let's watch me mess around with HTML, shall we? Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I actually think I want to change the state of this button so that it goes from showing our favorites if we're in the main screen to sort of going back to the main screen if we're looking at our favorites. Let's go ahead and do that. going to go into our HTML here, and we're going to find, here's our favorites button. And all right, first thing we're going to do, let's just copy and paste this so we have 2 buttons here. So we have my favorites, and we're going to create this other button, and our ID is going to be close favorites. Our label will be, I don't know, call it back to main. And I believe if we just say that this is close, then we'll get the close icon instead of the favorite icon. Let's reload that. All right, yay, we got a second button. This is ugly. Don't worry, we'll be fixing this. All right, so now we probably need to add a function to show you what happens when that gets clicked. So let's see. I might change this later, but for now, what we'll do is we've got our, add event listener for our query selector of favorite buttons. We're going to do essentially the same thing for our close favorites. So for our close favorites, we're going to add event listener that says stop looking at favorites. And we'll do update query. And I think we can even call, that .filters. And, I think that should work. Let's actually go ahead and reload this and see. So I can click this. This gets me into my favorites, which, as you recall, is sort of nothing. I'm going to click this. And all right, now I've stopped looking at my favorites. It's bothering me a little bit that my favorites array is empty. So here, you know what? I'm going to hard code a couple in for now, going back to that. So I'm going to remove this part where we're sort of, or you know what? Now I'll keep this. Sorry. For now, let's just keep our 2 macaron restaurants. Those look fantastic. Let's reload. Your favorites. Yay, we got a couple of favorites. Close it up. Hey, it's closed up. So let's see. So we got these 2 buttons. They're sort of side by side, not even side by side, and they're incredibly ugly. But we can now go ahead and sort of make these conditional. So if you look in our HTML, you might notice, by the way, there's an awful lot of stuff that begins with fur. Like, let me show you. Like, you notice we got this like data for if. And yeah, data for if not, and some other like data for content and all this. Basically what we've done is like we have sort of a rendering engine. If you kind of look over in, I think is it friendleads.view, like way down at the bottom in sort of the areas of the code that I haven't really delved into yet. This whole kind of friendleads prototype render function, this is kind of like our cheap and easy homegrown rendering engine. And basically, I think you probably get this functionality in things like Angular or Vue or, those types of rendering engines. But we sort of built our own quick and dirty one, essentially so that we're not playing favorites. We don't want people to get the wrong idea of like, oh, I see that Firebase only supports Angular because all their samples are in Angular or something like that. The point is this can kind of work in, any JavaScript. But so that we don't give you the idea that we're playing favorites, we've sort of built our own little kind of mini rendering engine that does a lot of this. And so basically what that means is, and again, probably you web folks, this makes total sense if you're not a web person. Basically what we're doing here is anywhere where you kind of see like a data for if, what our rendering engine is doing is it's looking and seeing, okay, do I have a variable that's been passed into my render function that's called this? And if so, is this true? If it is, then go ahead and sort of show whatever is in this section. Here, let me show you one that probably looks a little clearer. Well, actually, those are the only ones I got. So yeah, basically, it's our way of telling our rendering engine to conditionally render some part of our HTML if this variable happens to be true. I suppose that's the best way of describing it. So we can kind of go ahead and do that in our sections. Maybe I'll add a span. I don't know. Span data for if equals favorites. We'll put that around here. So if favorites equals true in our, sort of in our render function, go ahead and show this close button that says back to main. And then data for if not, favorites, basically says, okay, let's go ahead and not show this. I wonder if I could just make this an attribute of the section tag. I probably could. Maybe I'll try that later. And so basically then, if we go ahead and in our view function, if we go back into up here, our view list, where is it? Okay, our view list function, you'll notice that we're calling render template of header base, which is sort of this template that I am messing with. And we're passing in the function has section header true. I'm just going to go ahead and now pass in a second variable, favorites, equal to this local favorites variable. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and run this again. And what you'll see is that close button is now disappeared. And that's because, it's now evaluating. It's now basically evaluating that HTML. And it says, well, okay, favorites does not equal true here. Therefore, I'm just going to not render this section. And then hopefully, let's go back in and click on my favorites. Now that I've re-rendered it, I'm now hiding my favorite button and I'm showing my close button. So there you go. I can go back and forth between viewing at my favorites and not viewing my favorites. All right, well, maybe this is a good stopping point. So yay, we have a button that changes state. And we've pushed all of our stuff back up to the cloud. We've deployed everything. So I think sort of taking this lesson we've learned of having a button that changes state here, we can go ahead and add a button to add an item to my favorites. And we'll do that in the next video. So stay tuned.